Buenas noches, and a very warm welcome to this wonderful session and a unique kind of session in Charlas Magistrales that we organize within the framework of Ibero-American Voices, the unique Spanish and all the languages of Hispanic and almost Ibero-America. Today we have our very special guest, Pulitzer Prize winning poet Forrest Gander. Forrest Gander, for me, is one of my idols. One of my idols because when I started reading him, I discovered him much later in my life. But when I discovered him, that I was completely astonished by his work and by another by one of his passions and dedications, that is Spanish language. I myself is completely immersed and submerged into the language, I must say. And I like the language. I like the literature written in Spanish language across the globe, and and stuff like that. And through that way, I discovered the other self of Forrest. That is, and that brings him to our festival, which is for the Ibero-American languages. Although he writes in English, but he is a Hispanist as well, and his love of his life is Spanish language. So, a warm welcome, Forrest. Uh, Thank you for accepting our invitation to be here with us. Uh, and we are, as you said in your book, be with, and we are with you, and you are with us. That's very important for us, and a real pleasure. And I welcome you to the series.
I love what you say about how we are a different person as a translator. That you get to know me in English, and really I don't know you in the Bengali that you write in, but I know you in Spanish from your work. And I imagine there's slightly different people.
Maybe yes, they are. That you can that's what you are as well. No, so it's your when you write in English, and when you translate from Spanish, or when you check your translations into Spanish language, when your poems are being translated into Spanish language, they see a different. They seem to give a different flavor, no, altogether. Let's start with your journey. Uh, let's start with your childhood. As per the encyclopedic entries, you traveled a lot.
I traveled a lot because we were poor. It was just my mother and my two sisters and me. My mother was a elementary school teacher, and we couldn't afford to go on vacations. My father didn't help with. He wasn't around, and he didn't help with the family. So my mother would take us driving across the country. And it turned out to be much better than traditional vacations. I got to see a lot of the United States, and I got the bug about traveling and how it changes you, that when you're in a foreign place that you're not familiar with, you become the foreigner, and that makes you vulnerable. And it can, in your vulnerability, it can make you open to experiences that are new and unfamiliar. Y la misma cosa contigo, ¿no? En España al principio, ¿no?
Sí, sí, sí. También, ¿no? Que
¿Cuándo fuiste a España la primera vez?
En 2007.
Ajá.
En 2007, más tarde, mucho más tarde, pero esto ya pero me marcó completamente, ¿no? Háblanos un poquito también de tus días de adolescencia. How was your growing up days? And when did you start writing poetry?
I started writing poetry very early because my mother, as a school teacher, she loved poetry. And her father, who was Swedish, was of that generation born in the early 1900s. And he would walk around the house reciting poetry in English, old poems. You call me chief, and you do well to call him chief, who for 12 long years fought and faced every form of man or beast the Roman Empire could provide. He would stomp around the house reciting. My mother loved poetry, and she turned me on when I was very young to Edgar Allan Poe and to Carl Sandburg, who were important American poets. Mm-hmm. And so I started writing. It wasn't until I thought I was a poet in high school, and as an adolescent, I was writing a lot. But it wasn't until I went to college, my first year, my first couple weeks, I showed my poetry to an English professor. Mm-hmm. And he had a small office at College of William and Mary, and we were sitting close together, and he looked at some poems, and he looked up at me and said, "Forrest, these are terrible." And it was really an important moment for me because I realized that I would need to, that I was just doing it on my own, and that I hadn't read very much contemporary poetry. I was reading Poe and Carl Sandburg and Dylan Thomas, but I really hadn't explored the field. So then I realized it was mi responsabilidad informarme sobre el arte por leer.
Y también en este caso, Dylan Thomas no era americano, su lenguaje era muy inglés, que es muy diferente, ¿no? En tu caso, en Estados Unidos.
Yeah, very, very different. But for that also, that sort of flavor of the foreign, where you can hear things sometimes more acutely than you can hear in the familiar language that you're hearing all the time. So I felt like I'd learned from him. He has that richness that in English that Hopkins has, or that Les Amalima. It's almost a Baroque richness.
So when did you first start publishing poetry?
I think like a lot of poets, and I want to ask you about this too, that in the United States, there's such a pressure. You want to enter the scene. You want to have a place on the stage. So you can try to publish too soon. And I think most of us do that. So
everybody does the same thing here as well.
So I started to send work out when I was in graduate school, when I started seeing small magazines, but that work wasn't very good. And there's even a book that I published that maybe I should have not published. I should have waited to publish. Now, tengo más paciencia, el sentimiento de leer un poema de acabo de escribir y decirme, this is fantastic. Ese momento tiene que pasar. I have to wait a week, 2 weeks, look at the poem again, and it doesn't look the same. I realized this isn't finished.
Or maybe it was not that fantastic when I first finished writing that.
Yeah.
That moment comes.
What's your experience with publishing, and what was the scene like in
It
Uh,
was
and,
like early. My first chapbook was published in the year 2000. I was 22 years old and 21, barely, not even 22. I was 21, and my all those poems were written in that period only. But as you said, like I shouldn't have published that book. I shouldn't have published that book, and then I never re-edited that version ever in my life.
huh,
And but later on, I learned a very important lesson from an American poet, Robert Frost, who published his first book after crossing 40. And that was really astonishing for me. Like somebody could wait till 40th year of his life to be published for the first time as a poet. And that
yeah.
was a real lesson for me. But you say in the US now, nobody waits that much.
Todos los jóvenes quieren, llegar. Uh,
I
so one of the things that interests me about your poetry, and I'm curious about this too, is that it doesn't seem like a lot of the contemporary poetry that I read from India. That your poetry seems very internationally informed.
Oh,
Um,
thank you. Thank you.
is that the case? And were you reading widely already in other literatures outside of?
I started reading other literatures very early. When I was not satisfied at all with my surroundings, my own traditions, and my colleagues, my friends. So I was really frustrated. So I started exploring other worlds, and Spanish came to me in that way. So Latin America and Spain, both the countries, they opened a completely new door for me. It's the same for you as well. Spanish, did Spanish take
Spanish
a?
completely, it taught me to spread my wings out wider. And that's the beautiful thing, I think, about a translator. You
Mhm.
know, when the world blows up, I want to be with the translators because they have a humility. I think in the act of translation, we listen as deeply as possible to someone else's mind and to
Mm,
the music of their minds.
mhm,
That is a kind of egoless act.
mm,
Um, and in listening to other people's minds, we discover things that aren't in our own minds. And in
mm,
translation, you find uh, image repertoires and syntaxes and ways of using language that you can learn from, but that you wouldn't have arrived at by staying in your own language. La misma cosa para ti?
sí, sí, es exactamente lo mismo. Moreover, the way Spanish language taught me to not to write only about the experience, but to explore more inward. That was never there in me. So in contemporary Indian poetry, it's all very poetry of experience.
Sí, sí,
But
sí.
esto es, y en la poesía en español me enseñó a leer más profundamente y llegar a una poesía más profunda, más personal y al mismo tiempo más internacional.
Sí.
Eh, eh,
So that's in that second part of Ciudad Leopardo,
mm,
like Italo Calvino, you invent a region that hovers between the imaginary and the real. It's not
real.
the poetry of realism.
No,
Just as your vision of the leopard hovers between a real perception and an imagination, un juego de luz y sombra. Um, but instead of exoticizing the foreign, you describe a place where the sensual human body and the landscape and language all merge into each other. And that fascinates me.
oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really I'm really blushing. It's your interview, Forrest. It's let me ask you questions. And you are the so Your first book, a published book, is Rush to the Lake, 1988. And can you read some
Yeah,
poems from the book? Can you show us the book?
this is the book. It has a pretty cover that I was able to design myself of a
Great.
Greek diving into a lake. Some of these poems, some this is my first book, so a lot of the poems seem very far away from me, but I like this one. The title poem is called Rush to the Lake. Who is allowed in the inner circle by the boathouse to see the drowned schoolgirl? The father, crouched like a black rock. The lover, his lower lip shivers. A little back, the mother stands, blinking. The impassive water has slipped her its cold tongue. The nuns hold back the children who are straining to the edge of their faith for the dead to be like the wonderful dead in stories. As the poems in this book are more narrative based than my poems came to be later. I was reading a lot of Japanese poetry at the time, and another poem, curiously similar, I hadn't noticed the similarity, is a short poem which is based on a Japanese poet named Hajiwara. It's called After Hajiwara. A child was pulled from the lake. The schoolmates whispered into each other's ear. They whispered a dirty story into each other's funny, shell-shaped ear. The wind backed off. On the bed lies a woman. In her face, 2 eyes. So.
Muy bien, excelente. You studied geology, then English literature. When did your interest grow in Spanish language?
So I took one Spanish class in high school.
Oh.
And I really liked it. And when I was living in San Francisco, I met C.D. Wright, who became my wife, and started helping her run a book press called Lost Roads Publishers. And we got a grant from the government, from the National Endowment for the Arts, to publish 5 books. And neither of us had lived outside of the country or even been outside of the country. And we thought, with my 1 semester of Spanish, that maybe we could take this money, which was $10,000 to publish 5 books, and live in Mexico and publish the books there and live for years.
Brilliant idea.
So we went to Mexico without having much of the language. And then I started more intently, very intently, trying to learn the language. And one of the ways of learning the language, I thought, would be translation. And at that time, it was 1980, maybe 1980, 1980, 81. There was a kind of revolution in Mexico sobre las editoriales, porque the publishing world was controlled by men up until then. Vuelta, it was almost all men. And suddenly, small presses had appeared, and women were publishing their own poetry and finding their own outlets. And a lot of that writing I found to be the most interesting writing I was seeing. And so I began to correspond with some of the poets that I liked, who turned me on to their friends. And I came to translate this book, mouth to mouth. I didn't do all the translations. I edited it and did some translations, but it's a collection of contemporary Mexican women.
Oh, great.
The first that was done in the US.
And it was published in your publishing house that City Right used to run.
No, I didn't want to publish. I don't want to publish my own books with my own publishing house. So it was published by a wonderful press called Milkweed Editions.
Oh. And then you did some poetry come in your Mexican experience when you were living in Mexico?
Of course, that experience again, like you in Spain, living in Spain and being attentive to the difference around you and of living in another language that completely alters your experience. It expands your experience.
It expands wings, as you said.
Yeah. So so that changed my poetry, and I also felt like I became hooked on translation, on that deep kind of reading.
You became friends with Mexican poets, as you said. Who were those friends? Corral Bracho was among them?
Corral Bracho, Veronica Volkov, Gloria Gervitz, Kira Galvan, Elva Macias. Hay muchos.
Hay muchos. And all of them, you were almost contemporaries. So did they influence you as a writer as well?
Absolutamente, sin duda. Por ejemplo, I'd never seen work like Corral Bracho's before. In her work, the subjectivity, the human subjectivity seems to transfer itself to the environment, whether it's in a room or whether it's in the landscape. And it's also very sound-based. Cuando su poesía, tengo que poner atención en los sonidos, porque los sonidos hacen sentido, otro sentido, algunas veces más importante than the semantic sense. And that really educated my ear.
Can you read some of your Mexican poems, at least one?
So, let's see if I can. Here's a nice poem by Corral Bracho. So let me read a little bit of it in Spanish, so you can hear the sound. Agua de bordes lúbricos, agua de medusas, agua láctea, sinuosa, agua de bordes lúbricos, espesura vidriante, deliquescencia entre contornos deliciosos, agua suntuosa, de involución, de languidez, intensidades plácidas, agua sedosa y plumbia, en opacidad, en peso, mercurial, agua en vilo, agua lenta, el agua acuática de los bríos, en las ubres de gozo, en el alga, el hálito de su cima. So you hear all those ooh and o sounds, and also a lot of liquid s sounds. So in translating, I'm very much trying to pick up some of that sonic meaning from her work, because that's the emotional meaning in the poetry.
It's a very strange thing that I feel right now. The sound of the letter S in Spanish language is somehow, it's the most special sound for me. Like it doesn't exist in any other language, neither in Bangla, in Bengali, nor in English, nor in any of my known languages. It's a very special resonance. And
de acuerdo.
¿Verdad? Esto es como, no existe en otra lengua. Ese sonido es muy especial para mí. I must let our invisibles listeners today and my future listeners. Forrest introduced the unpublished Neruda poetry to the English-speaking world. So, how was your experience with Pablo Neruda's poetry? How was your encounter with Neruda?
So, la
The
cosa
joy.
graciosa es que estaba diciendo antes de traducir su poesía, estaba diciendo en público, no necesitamos más traducciones de Neruda, tenemos bastante, hay bastante. And so I was giving advice to people, translate someone new. But they discovered these poems after the death of his third wife, and going through his archives, the archivists discovered poems that no one had seen before. They were written on menus, they were written on musical performance sheets. Some were typed up and completely finished. Some were typed up but had variations and notes on them. And when I heard about it, al principio, I thought, what a terrible idea. If he had wanted to publish these poems, he would have published them. And I thought, they're just trying to squeeze the last juices from Neruda. Pero después de leer las publicaciones en España de esa poesía, I saw they were fantastic. Neruda, you know, it was Neruda. They were fantastic poems. And I was given the opportunity. There was a bidding war in the US for translation rights. And I was asked to be one of several translators to submit examples of my translations, and they chose them. And so we translated this book, The Lost Neruda Poems.
Neruda poems. Will you read some of one at least from the Lost Neruda?
I would love to read one. Should I read it in English or in the translation? Or?
Yes, please. I want to listen to your translation.
Okay. So Neruda is writing this poem during the space race. And as you may know, he had a kind of crush on a Russian cosmonaut. You don't know. So this is his poem. It doesn't have a sin título. Those two solitary men, those first men up there, what of ours did they bring with them? What from us, the men of earth? It occurs to me that the light was fresh then, that an unwinking star journeyed along, cutting short and linking distances, their faces unused to the awesome desolation in pure space, among astral bodies polished and glistening like grass at dawn. Something new came from the earth, wings or bone coldness, enormous drops of water, or surprise thoughts, a strange bird throbbing to the distant human heart. And not only that, but cities, smoke, the roar of crowds, bells and violins, the feet of children leaving school, all of that is alive in space now, from now on, because the astronauts didn't go by themselves. They brought our Earth, the odors of moss and forest, love, the crisscrossed limbs of men and women, terrestrial rains over the prairies. Something floated up like a wedding dress behind the two spaceships. It was our spring on Earth, blooming for the first time, that conquered an inanimate heaven, depositing in those altitudes the seed of our kind.
So it's the same Neruda who it's like a salamander. He puts his tongue into anything and takes out poetry from there.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah.
it's that gigantic Neruda. And let me come to with that cosmonaut and extra terrestrial note. I would like to come back to your very own poetics, eco poetics. And you are one of the very few writers who are pioneers in eco poetics in the whole world. Can you tell us a little about that idea? The very first book that I read of you was Core Samples from the Earth. And that book shook me literally, because it is really an impactful book. And the way you treat the subject, the way you, everything, it is there now. I cannot see, after reading that book, I cannot see, like in Delhi, we experience a lot of smog. And on the other day, I told you about that storm in China. Well, whenever I see this kind of disasters, I think about your word, xanthic shadow. It's like it's there. It's in me. It's like I cannot think about a sunny day without Baudelaire. I cannot think about it's the same thing. I cannot think about a disaster, about an ecological disaster without thinking some of your imageries. You have become so synonymous for me after reading that book.
I feel that same way when I read a poem of yours like Hacia la Ociencia, that there's a kind of phenomenological approach to poetry. I think with eco-poetry, that the sense is that our idea of nature poetry has failed us, because it's often descriptions of something outside of us.
Exactly.
You know, the poet goes outside, the poet sees a flower, comes back in and writes a poem of ecstasy about it. But in the 21st century, what we realize is that everything is connected, that there's no such thing as a single tree, because trees are all connected by mycelial connections, that they speak to each other, that they're involved with other plants in synergistic ways, and that our sense of our independence from the rest of the world, as if we could control it, has led to the disaster that we're in now, which is we are in an ecological crisis that will profoundly change the world. The ocean's dying, species are disappearing at a fantastic rate, and deserts are expanding so rapidly. We all know the stories. So how do poets, if they feel implicated in this, as everyone in the human species is, how might they respond? And one way might be to approach writing about what's outside of us in a way where it's so tangled up with what we are that that we can't see the difference. And we realize that in talking about the world, we're talking about ourselves. And very curiously, what I learned in writing in these last few years is that in South India, in Tamil Nadu, there's a tradition of poetry from 300 BC to 300 AD. It was the Sangam literature. And there's two main kinds of poetry in that Sangam literature, but the Akam poetry also 2000 years ago was making the connection between human feeling being inseparable from the place where it's in, from a landscape. So in my newest book, which just came out, this is the first copy I've seen, it's called Twice Alive. There are a lot of poems influenced by the Sangam tradition that are also a kind of eco-poetry.
in India, like ancient tradition wise, especially in early Buddhism and in some Vedic traditions as well, like we have never taught to distinguish between human being and other beings. Like as we are equally placed in in somewhere by some miracle of God or something like that. Although in Buddhism there's no God, but in other philosophies there were some creators. So like any other cosmogony, like anything, like sun was a creator. So everybody under the earth was the same. It's a creature created by the same loving being. So we have to love, like we have to be connected with them. So it's very interesting. So did somehow Gary Snyder influence you, or W.S. Merwin?
Momentito. Gary Snyder is on my wall right next to my desk. Can you see this photo, Subhro?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
I can.
We went and visited him last year. He's 90 years old. He's still living alone in the middle of the forest,
Middle of nowhere.
and in a house that he built by hand. And he's very lucid and sharp. He's been a hero of mine for a long time. And Merwin also was a dear friend, and someone, he once awarded me a prize called the Witter Binner Prize, which is sort of for a writer who is also a translator. But in fact, when I was in graduate school, my teacher criticized me for writing too much like William Merwin, which I did.
And Merwin has a Spanish connection too. He knew Spanish and he translated from Spanish as well. It's the same around world. I don't know Gary Snyder knew Spanish or not, but he had essentially an Oriental connection, Japanese and India, Buddhism and India. And for the my last question to you.
Before we get to your last question, can I bring the attention back to you a little bit and just say an example of ecopoesia in your own work is, I mean, let me read these lines and listen to the way, for the audience, the way that the landscape, the language, and the human body are integrated in these lines. No hay amanecer en los montes que suben por la topografía del cuerpo. Solo se brilla en los picos desafilados. Muerdo. Los afectados son los signos de puntuación, los pulmones, la velocidad de la sangre, la guitarra eléctrica, el retórico, el collado de las tardes de sábado. I should have had you read it.
Oh, but such a privilege. Such a privilege.
No, es un privilegio leerlo.
It is like I never distinguished really between never differentiated between the world I live in and between myself and the world I live in. That's why it is the case, and I'm deeply moved. Always, I was deeply moved by W.S. Merwin since long time. He's one of my favorite poets of all time, and so my last question to you would be about this twice alive. Since you are now exploring Indian poetics and other things, so would you like to read more and more about Indian philosophy as well?
I have been, yeah, India, of all the travels that I've had, and I've traveled quite a lot around the world, I have never seen a chaos like India. And it's a beautiful chaos. It really interests me. It's a it's chaotic architecturally, where everything is a palimpsest of the different rulers, and it's chaotic linguistically, where you never hear in a conversation less than 3 languages.
No.
You know, there'll be Hindi and a local language and a couple words of English,
Yes.
al menos. And then the traffic, of course, is chaotic.
We live in a city which is officially quadrilingual. So it's a quadrilingual city. So there are 4 official languages till date. In Delhi municipality has 4 official languages: Hindi, Urdu, English, and Punjabi. So obviously it is there always. Yeah. Thank you so much, Forrest, for your interest, for being with us. And thank you, Marty, and thank you, Instituto Cervantes. Thank you, Oscar Pujol. Thank you, Santiago, Embassy of Mexico, for giving us this opportunity to talk to Forrest Gander, who is not only a friend of Mexico, but also a friend of India, and was one of the leading poets of the contemporary world. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you, especially Instituto de Cervantes. All over the world, it's making company. Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias, Subhro.
Gracias.
Estaremos en contacto, ¿no?
Estaremos en contacto.
Okay.
Claro. Ciao.
Hasta luego, Santiago. Jen, oh, I can't believe you're there too. Hi.
Bye.
Okay. Adios.
Adios.